Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Bienvenue au Musée des beaux-arts de Montréal. Greetings to you all, and thank you so much for being here with us despite this freezing cold. My name is Danielle Roberge, Cultural Programming Officer. Welcome to this last day of special events in link with the exhibition Peter Doig, No Foreign Lands. As you may know now, Doig is one of the most highly regarded and exciting painters working today. His willingness to take up the challenge still posed by the paintings of Gauguin, Matisse, Bonnard, Marsay Hartley, and Edward Hopper places him in the long lane of great colorists, expressive handlers of paint, and creator of richly textured worlds. Doig spent his youth in Montreal and in the Eastern Townships, and it is here that he acquainted himself with the work of such major Canadian painters as David Milne, James William Morris, and Ozias Leduc, of which he is a fine connoisseur. Today, it is a really great pleasure to welcome Sarah Milroy. She's a very active art critic, writes for the Globe and Mail, independent curator, and author at the Canadian Art Magazine, where she published the essay entitled Peter Doig, Continental Drifter. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sarah Milroy.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. It truly is. I changed the slide when I came into this because I felt that we needed a sense of respite after this pilgrimage. It is splendid to be here because it's not often as a writer that you get the chance to think further about a subject that you've just published on. And of course, at the time that things go to press is when you realize there's actually another thing you wanted to say, or a little foxhole that you wanted to pursue, or isn't it too bad that we couldn't put this, and this photograph in the magazine with the articles? So when you give a talk, you get to have your own way, which is always nice. It's also, a great pleasure, of course, to be here in Montreal to see this spectacular exhibition. And I don't know if Stéphane is here today, but it's an extraordinarily beautiful installation and very, very suggestive. I hope it will be more open to reading after you listen to me today, but very, very subtle in how it suggests possible readings of the paintings. It doesn't hammer you over the head, not too text heavy, but just enough to kind of season your viewing, and really, really masterful. There are many different ways of approaching a talk about Doig. You could talk about Doig and photography, Doig and cinema, and of course the show has some a wonderful series of Doig's cinema posters from the Studio Film Club that he started in Trinidad. You could do Doig and literature, I believe. You could do Doig in the context of contemporary painting. But what we're going to talk about today is really Doig in relationship to colonialism and to the problems around people of European extraction going to what are to us exotic tropical places and making paintings that give pleasure and that record pleasure. And I'm going to race through a little history of post-colonial discourse for people in the audience that may be turning over these ideas for the first time. But to me, Doig's work is fundamentally about trying to come to an understanding about a certain kind of displacement or a sense of disorientation from the landscapes that he finds himself in. And of course, the show upstairs is really about the last 12 years of paintings made in Trinidad. But before we get to those, back to this, which will actually be our last slide today, I want to take you back to my own first encounter with Doig, which would be in 2001. In the power plant. I was working full-time at the Globe at that time, and it was my happy task to write about Peter's show there, which had been organized by Kitty Scott, who's now the curator of contemporary at the AGO. And these were Canadian landscape paintings like I'd never seen them before. They seemed to sort of herald a new a new tradition, a new generation of landscape painting, and also to be very sophisticated in how they treated that subject. The subject here, the title of the painting, of course, is Blotter, and it's applicable on two levels. First of all, a blotter, at least in my understanding in English, is a term that is like a piece of paper that you use on a desk in a traditional way for writing on. It gives the ink a nicer sort of kiss to the paper if there's something soft underneath it. And so in English houses, there would be a blotter on the desk you could test your nibs on. So it has to do with a certain delectation in making a mark to me. But it's also, blotter is also a term used for, it's the way in which you take lysergic acid. If you take LSD, it's given to you on a little, not that I would of course know, a little blotter, a little piece of paper that's soaked. And once you have taken this drug, this is kind of what it feels like, a sense of magnificent immersion in the natural world, a sense of being almost stupefied and beguiled by the beauty of things. And this figure, looks down at his own feet in amazement. You can sort of tell by the bodily stance. So it's that great Canadian tradition, perhaps unknown to the group of seven, of being stoned in the landscape. And and I was amazed that he could make such a beautiful contemplative picture of this subject. It really has always been one of my favorite paintings of Doig's. There were also paintings in this show that were about skiing and about snowboarding and about the landscape mediated by tourism and by athleticism and so on. So again, these were subjects in art that lurked around the edges of the group of seven, the idea of tourism in particular, but were never sort of explicitly addressed. There was also this extraordinarily odd painting, which is another one of my favorites, which I fell deeply in love with that day that I saw it. It is based on here, you see Doig here very much reconnecting to his, Canadian art historical roots, because it's Franklin Carmichael. And Carmichael, for those in the audience that don't know Carmichael, the hooded figure here, obviously is taken from a photograph, is one of the kind of also-rans from the group of seven. He's the one when people are going, they always forget Carmichael. And so now he's having his apotheosis here. He's sketching in the landscape in this strange picture. And I can honestly say that these paintings of Carmichael, and there's a series of them, kind of triggered my own fascination with Canadian art history, which had been sort of dormant up until that point. But I'd been mostly interested in contemporary art. But this series of pictures is so, makes strange what had seemed to be so familiar, that it intrigued me and made me wonder. It sort of stripped away the accretion of myth that had gathered around the group of seven paintings and made them suddenly seem extremely odd. And, what exactly were these men doing out in the woods, having these epiphanies away from the city and riding in boxcars and camping out in Algonquin Park and these places. This was made just near Sudbury, actually, in an area called the La Cloche Hills. But it made the familiar strange. And which I would say is something that Doig does generally. So that was my entree to Peter's work, and then I didn't really see Doig's work for quite a long time. And the next time I saw him, the work was looking suddenly. Oh, wait a minute, I've got myself turned around. First of all, we're going to do post-colonialism. Okay, let me just take you forward to what I actually saw next, which was this painting. This painting and this painting. I believe I saw them in London or possibly at the Carnegie International, I'm not sure. But, they seemed very, very different to me than the works that he'd made of Canadian subjects. And I was a little bit like, okay, he's moved to Trinidad by now. What the heck is going on here? Like, it made me anxious. It was like a white person goes to Trinidad and I kind of thought in my mind, it's like the Calypso Christ, with the Rastafarian rainbow, and is this really okay, And this painting here, it's taken actually from a postcard of India. And the bigger work that this picture is upstairs, and so is the larger work that this is, in a sense, a study for. But, it's John the Baptist. So what does that mean when a white artist goes to Trinidad and makes paintings about John the Baptist? I mean, I was getting uncomfortable. I now realize, having thought about the paintings for a long time, like 2004, so that what's important about these paintings is the fact that there is no context for the figure, really, that there is no landscape in which they're situated. This is very unlike the work that came before this, and seems to signal a kind of rupture and a new line of questioning in his work overall. And I believe that is because he was grappling with the meanings and in a sense, the pleasures, but also the discomforts of being, in essence, a European artist, in this tropical location where he had, in fact, been a child as well. I always joke, just as an aside with Peter, that, we like to call him a Canadian artist in Canada, and the English call him an English artist, and I don't know if the Trinidadians call him a Trinidadian artist, but they may well. And I once said to him, you've got to hope that they don't find out you were conceived in France, or they're going to be trying to lay claim to you, and you're ours, as far as I'm concerned. So let's go back here to Gérôme. So why might, what is the history of this disquietude about the European making paintings in, quote, exotic locations? This whole discussion really starts with a theoretician named Edward Said, who wrote a very important book in 1978 called Orientalism. And what Said talked about was the way in which the colonizing imagination declares, while seeming to kind of revel in the beauty of the colonized culture, actually kind of, in making what appears to be a kind of definitive account of it, actually sort of subjugates it. And by turning indigenous subjects into objects of fascination, dehumanizes. And there's a comparable phenomenon, for example, Edward Curtis's photographs of the Aboriginal people of the northwest coast of BC, and I've been doing quite a bit of work on that recently because I'm working on an exhibition on Emily Carr. And it's the same kind of thing. I mean, this painting was likely made, in the Parisian studio where this man of who knows what history, personal history, is dressed up in costume. Curtis likewise made both in the land of the headhunters and a series of photographs as well of the Aboriginal people of the Kwakwakwa Nation, who he dressed up as savages. Like, he gave them wigs to make their hair more crazy and devised costumes for them and so on. So it's the idea of the colonizer coming in and picturing the colonized in the way that he sees fit. And of course, this has been the subject of academic scrutiny, certainly before, but increasingly more and more so after 1978. And this picture by Gérôme seems to me a kind of perfect example of that phenomenon. But then, after that tradition, we get into Degas, who always makes things more complicated. And in fact, when I went in the spring to visit Peter Doig in the course of preparing the cover story for Canadian Art, this was a picture that he had open in the studio and was thinking about very carefully. There'd been an exhibition at the Morgan Library, and this figure of Miss Lala at the Cirque Fernando. Miss Lala was a bit of a celeb in Paris at this time. She was half Prussian and half of African descent, and I'm sorry I don't know which country she had come from. But her trick was to hang on to, but just with her jaw, with her teeth, hang on to things and dangle from precipitous heights. Her other stunt was to hook her knees over the trapeze and suspend a 150-pound cannon from her teeth. So to me, it's, Degas is always using perspective in all of his paintings to create a sense of unquiet and dis-ease. And this is really a masterpiece in that regard. And that it has this racial issue woven into it, I think, is probably why Peter was so preoccupied with the picture. The idea of the Parisians of the day being kind of fetishizing this jaw of what they would have termed negress woman in the Parisian acrobat. So there's Degas, and I would propose Degas as the originator of what I might think of as, if Said is Orientalism, I found myself thinking about, maybe there's a tradition of disorientalism, where you're looking at something which is deemed to be, which you're experiencing as other, experiencing as alien to you, but you're kind of going out of your way to register that dis-ease, or that disorientalism, so disorientation. So one of the artists that gets talked about most in terms of post-colonialism is Gauguin, and it really became a kind of shorthand to think about, Degas as a bad guy. As Peter once said to me, I don't think he was a bad guy. I think he was registering what kind of concerning experiences he was having as a European subject. He was so fascinated, Gauguin, by this, that he actually moved, of course, famously to Tahiti, where he was very disappointed to find that European influence was quite pervasive, and he was always looking to find a way, really, to sort of escape Europe and its histories. But when you actually look at Gauguin, he gets a bad rap for painting naked ladies, and he gets a bad rap for exoticizing the indigenous people of Tahiti. But when you actually look at the pictures, what strikes one more is that often the female subjects in particular are turned away, or their facial features, or what they're actually doing is kind of inscrutable. So they're actually often paintings, this is a classic example, where they're not particularly endearing or inviting images. There are some exceptions to that in Gauguin's work, but overall, I think that the pictures of Tahiti are of a kind of sense of disturbed seeing and uncertainty about what is being looked at, and it is that I think comes forward in Doig. Here, you can't tell land from sea. Is that a cresting wave, or is it foliage? What's going on here? And likewise here. So the question of what's going on here, strikes me as something that Doig picks up on. I add this, Munch did not paint tropical themes, but I threw him into the lineup here because I think he is kind of the king of quease, I would say. When it comes to queasiness, Munch uses a kind of indeterminacy of touch, a kind of strategic, effacing of detail to provoke a sense of uneasiness, or at least, if not intentionally, it produces a sense of uneasiness in the viewer who's trying to figure out what's going on. And I put this slide up because when I was interviewing Doig, we talked about the Munch show that had been at the Tate in London, and he mentioned to me, there's this one painting, and I haven't seen it since, I haven't seen a reproduction, but it's of a guy in a white suit standing in the street. That's all I remember, is a guy with a white suit. So I went, got the catalog, looked through. And what struck me, because we had been talking about colonialism all the way through our interview, is that the guy in the white suit has actually been attacked by someone, and he's being confronted here by, in essence, a black subject, and whose features we cannot see, and who's rendered kind of, again, inscrutable. And it's not clear, he doesn't seem to be beating the guy up. So, what's actually happening here? Has some violence been done to this white figure somewhere else? Or is it about to be done again? Or what's happening? It seems to me sort of a radical example of Munch's ability to provoke disquiet by being unclear. And I wanted everyone to just take a look at this, because obviously there's such a marvelous connection between Doig's use of a kind of simplified, approximating, movement of the paint, and his own work, which, this is just, I think, quite extraordinary to see. I'll just flip back again, that relationship and the moodiness and the sense. You'll see, the faces of these figures are largely effaced. We don't know who they are or what kind of experience they're having. I feel, and you'll decide for yourself when you spend time in the show, but I feel with Doig that a lot of times the kind of hard to pin down feeling of uneasiness that we have really arises from those kinds of generalizations and the way that we have to kind of pour ourselves into the paintings to complete them. And I do feel like that's something that comes to him from, at least in terms of European painting, from Munch and from Emil Nolde as well, who's also very important to him. So here we're back to Peter Doig, and this painting, which explicitly, it's dated 202 to 208, so it started at least right after Doig moves with his family to Trinidad. And the subject matter is taken from a newspaper clipping of, what do we call it, a reenactment of Columbus discovering Trinidad. So kind of a loaded subject. And but he takes the clipping and turns it into this, very mysterious painting, which I think kind of, as I say, declares his addressing head-on a problem that he is about to immerse himself in as a European, relocating himself in Trinidad. We've spoken about St. John the Baptist here, and the Calypso Christ. And here he even takes the idea of placelessness to another level where, he's as if trying to make more clear that this is, that he is experiencing himself as a subject that is in a kind of a vacuum, or not sure what the context is for his tradition. Of course, Christian iconography being the staple of European painting, and here it's quite literally adrift. One of the titles that we thought about for the show, the essay for Canadian art, which we called Continental Drifter, was Nowhere Man, because because Doig's own personal history of mobility and migration means that really he is sort of at home everywhere and nowhere. And to me, this, Purple Jesus, of course, he's taking the Mickey. Purple Jesus here is a kind of nowhere man to me. The European tradition kind of adrift in a kind of oblivion of blue, very beautiful blue. So this series of paintings, again, in terms of disorientalism, if I can use that term again, there's a number of these paintings in the show. They're some of my favorites. They arise, though, there's several different strains that feed into the pelican or stag paintings. Doig came across a postcard from India of a man dragging nets that interested him. But it didn't really click as a painting subject until he witnessed in a kind of an uncomfortable way one day a Trinidadian man, fisherman, on the beach in Trinidad, where he takes these epic kayak trips on the north coast. And I believe it was on such an occasion that he found himself observing a Trinidadian man strangling a pelican on the beach. He had gone out and caught the pelican, and he was swinging it by the neck and then dragging it. And he didn't, Doig didn't know what he was looking at. He was kind of like, what the hell's going on? What is that? And then he realized what it was. And in the moment that he realized what was going on, his gaze was returned by this man on the beach who was not that happy to be being watched by him. So it was a moment of kind of a encounter and dis-ease between them. And perhaps it's that forged in his imagination this picture, which has such a sense of unclarity about whether the subject is really of menace. There's so much left to your imagination, and the strategic use of light and darkness. He takes it through several iterations. I mean, I'm restraining myself from effusing about the handling of paint in this because I could make you all quite ill, I think. But there are, gorgeous passages of where Doig, if you look in the show carefully, you'll see where he mixes thinner into the paint so it can drip and run, and in other places, really loads it on as a kind of a paste. And there's such an incredible range of touch in what he's doing. It's extraordinary. Here's one of the more menacing ones, in a sense. Here he doesn't look like a pelican anymore, but it's still not clear what kind of an encounter is taking place. There's also a series based on this. This was also based on a photograph from India of boys being transported. And I think I'm trying to remember how many of these I have. That's Manet, this one, and this one. So there's three, and I think there may be more in the exhibition. But what's odd about this is, first of all, the subjects. There are a lot of people in that boat. Like, this is not a pleasure trip. Like, it's not at all clear what is happening. One has the sense, because of the sameness of their attire, that perhaps they're in some form of, servitude, maybe even enslaved. It's they're being ferried somewhere to do work. It's, I don't know, all your assumptions come kind of flooding forward and then hit a wall of confusion because no answers, of course, are given. It's intriguing to me, too, that Doig paints this subject sometimes with the faces of the figures appearing to be white. So you know, and I asked him about this, and you know, he sort of said, "Oh, I didn't really notice that. I wasn't really thinking about that." But it's if the phenomenon of in a series, a theme of variations in Doig of the subjects subbing in as black and then as white in later series. That happens with the Pelican series too. There's some in which the man on the beach appears to be white, and I find that a kind of, I mean, I'm interested in psychology, but and what perhaps sometimes that things are expressed that aren't intended, and you know, I find that kind of an interesting thing to think about, what is lying behind that sense of worrying at the subject and his relationship to it. I just wanted to throw up, too, this little Manet painting, which I saw. It was in a show in Venice, actually, in the summertime. And I think I recall Peter explained to me that this had been an inspiration, too. It's Rochefort's Escape is about a famous communard who was against the imperial regime in France and famously, you know, escaped. And so the idea of there's a kind of history in terms of this image of the little shallop boat, you know, stuffed with people that has this kind of radical pedigree to it. I also, of course, here there is the sense of, I think about Yeats's, you know, blood-dimmed tide, the sense of blood leaching into the, you know, a kind of a hemorrhaging on the painting surface, as if to belie a kind of violence that perhaps we can't see. Then we start to get into these paintings of walls, which I think are very interesting. And in this one, before we talk about walls, these are pictures that reference the tradition of the Mardi Gras. And Doig expressed to me really his fascination with that history. It was a time when traditional hierarchical colonial relations were kind of turned upside down, and servants could make fun of their white masters. And you know, this is actually taken from a source photograph of Peter and a friend of his dressed up in costume. He worked in the theater as a scene painter for almost 10 years. And in fact, in Montreal, he told me with some pleasure that the person who he worked for would only let him paint walls because he didn't think he was much of a painter. So So he got really good at painting walls, and particularly creating the effect of a distressed wall. That was his sort of forte. And it turned out to actually acclimatize him to the idea of painting large, which has proved to be very important to him, and also, you know, is his first kind of immersion in, you know, getting his licks together on how to actually do that. So the Mardi Gras is referenced here, which is, again, a time, you know, in terms of colonial relations of dis-ease or disruption. And this figure, you know, both comes from Daumier's painting of the print collector, which from the 1860s, which is a very, very important picture. And Japanese prints were flooding Paris at this time. And so to paint a print collector is to actually paint someone who's submerged in a kind of connoisseurship of the other in Paris at that time. And but Doig reimagines him as a kind of clown, and with the top hat, and in a kind of, you know, Mardi Gras costume in a way. I'm just trying to recall if I have. Yes, I have the other one here, where he's more of a clown. The patches on the jacket do not come from Daumier. They are, you know, part of Doig's creation here, and the red nose and the white face of the figure refers to the tradition in Mardi Gras in Trinidad of people painting their faces white and having a red nose, which was an indication of the white man, because the white man would always have this pasty skin, but would always have a burnt nose. So it's easy to think of this as a clown in the traditional sense, but in fact the red nose relates to our, you know, ill-suitedness to that environment as white people. And Peter shared with me that the view in the background here is actually the view from his studio. So one can understand this painting really as a self-portrait of himself as the clown, as the European, you know, newly resettled in Trinidad, trying to figure out, as he put it to me, what in the world am I doing here? Like, how can I be an artist here where I'm so out of my element? The painting there you'll see that's sort of faintly suggested is one of the stag pelican paintings, which he's just sketching in. So again, he kind of suggests a wall that seems to, with his own work on it, which is kind of obscuring his ability to immerse himself in the thing itself, the landscape of Trinidad, which lies really beyond both spatial observation and his own true ability to understand it, not being of that culture. This interest in walls continues with this one, and I noticed in the exhibition something that I hadn't seen before, which is a clipping about a body being found, and I did a little Google research, and I think I'm right in saying that the incident records the finding of a corpse behind this wall. So, my contention is that these walls that are such a persistent motif in Doig are actually kind of metaphors for the barriers of our own ability to understand things. The real world lies beyond the wall. All we can see is our own, we can't really see into the other. We can only confront our own limitations for understanding and make something of them. So he paints the wall, and you see there's this curious, it appears to be a boat sailing on the top of the wall, and I think what that is a kind of giving us an extra hint that, trying to create an additional disjuncture between the wall as the subject and an imagined beyond, which is an ocean with a boat on it in a more conventional landscape. He kind of refuses to allow himself that in this painting. And this is another wall painting. This is a smaller little picture. I can't remember if it's upstairs. But the Lion of Judea, if I'm right, is associated with the Rastafarian religion. It's also, of course, the British lion rampant is a traditional icon of British monarchy, and so it kind of goes both ways. And he finds this figure on the wall of I'm just going to skip forward to here, on the wall of the Prosperity bar in Port of Spain, which is a place that I think he likes to frequent. And there's source photographs that show that this is a fairly faithful rendering of this wall with, again, a suggestion of landscape beyond it. These flags are all flags of Caribbean and African nations, which were in the process of self-determination at that time, the Pan-African movement. And 62, which is around the time I think Doig's family leaves Trinidad shortly after that. But Trinidadian independence is achieved in 1962. And so, in a way, his life story was swept up in this global change in terms of self-determination. And I think, I see this painting as kind of emblematic of that. It's also, of course, any paintings of walls are paintings of flat surfaces. And one of the great debates in modernist painting is the dichotomy between creating a space that you look into with the kind of assumption of three-dimensionality of looking through a window into a space versus looking at an object, a piece of fabric stretched over a wooden frame that is a thing in the world. And the tradition in modernist painting that you find in Montreal and of course many others is to use the grid as a formal device in the painting to foreground the fact that you're looking at an object, you're looking at a flat thing. And in fact, when you think back to Blotter, that first image at the very beginning, he's looking down at a flat thing. So there's kind of two planes being suggested in that painting as well. One that he's looking down at in the reflection of the ice and the surface of the picture that you're looking at. So it is really a picture about looking at a flat thing. This is also about looking at a flat thing. And the idea here, that the source for this image was a stack of beer crates that he saw, and he sets this white, what appears to be a tourist at leisure in front of it. There's a real contrast set up between the kind of rectilinear world of order and reason that this figure is inhabiting here with the ping pong table and the bat and so on, and the kind of more loose and flowing landscape that forms a kind of screen around it. This is one of the weirdest paintings in the show. I absolutely love it. But, again, here the modernist grid has kind of gone all haywire. There's a number of different, iterations of it being suggested. Wonderful, wonderful color, and this very strange way in which beauty, the beauty of the pink blossoms that becomes this kind of necrotic decay on the body. It's as if, to me, looking at this, and perhaps this is a bit too poetic a reading, but it seems to show a kind of disease about beauty when the beauty starts out as a petal and ends up becoming a kind of lesion. It seems to me that he's worrying at something about his own ability to produce these beautiful, beautiful effects. And again, there's a strong formal contrast between the kind of draping organic shapes and the rectilinear shapes in the picture. Now, we are in Montreal, and when people talk about Doig, they talk an awful lot about the Group of Seven, and they talk about Milne in regard to Canadian painting. And, they touch upon Maurice, but Maurice would have been an artist that Doig would have seen a great deal of coming to this museum in his formative earlier years. And so, it intrigues me that Maurice is another great painter of walls. He has the same fixation. And in fact, Maurice has a very similar life in some sense to Doig. His very name is kind of riddled with issues of displacement, because we pronounce his name Maurice because he comes from Quebec, but actually his name was Morris. His father, David Morris, gave Morris Hall to McGill University up the hill. Prosperous textile merchant. They had a mansion a block or so from here, which I believe has since been demolished. But Maurice, was an Anglophone Quebecer who fell in love with French painting. And, an Anglophone Quebecer who is called by a French pronunciation of his name, who goes to France to become himself. So I think we're in the realm of the Doigian here. And he went back and forth between Paris. He became quite a fixture in the Parisian art scene. He was an intercontinental drifter, like Doig. And he was, judging the Salon d'Automne in 1908. Has quite a following. He's hanging out with Matisse, sharing a studio with Matisse in North Africa. And Matisse expresses, there's a quote in which Matisse expresses his interest in Maurice's art and seeing him as very talented, although he does note his fondness for the bottle, which was eventually the undoing of him. He ended up dying in North Africa. But these paintings of walls that he made in these, to him, exotic locations, I think are very thought-provoking in relationship to Doig and what Doig was struggling with as a European in Trinidad. They seem to arouse our curiosity about what lies beyond, what we cannot see, and what we are not permitted to have access to. And I've just selected a few, but there are a number of them. This one is in this collection here. This one is taken out of a book written by Blair Lang on the floor of my studio, so please forgive the terrible slide. This one just changed hands in 2011, and if anyone knows where this painting is, please tell me, because it was bought by someone and we don't know where it is. But you can see when you look at these pictures that first of all, there's a lot of skill about leaving things blank and giving your imagination space to roam. There's a lot of connoisseurship in the touch, and a sense of being the outsider and the voyeur. I think that's very poignant. And Peter told me when I interviewed him that we looked at these pictures together, and he said, there's a prison in downtown Port of Spain that's painted Coleman mustard yellow. I thought, how much more English than that can one get? But indeed, he was right. It is Coleman mustard yellow, and the prison in Port of Spain is right downtown. And so the people inside the prison, and the wall's not much higher than this, but the people inside the prison can hear the daily life of Port of Spain going on all around them. And it's very unusual for a prison to be located in that way, and he has an ongoing fascination with that prison wall, and I imagine we'll be seeing it. I'm hoping we'll be seeing it soon. But the idea of what you cannot have access to and what you cannot see, and of course Maurice's paintings also, I can't call him Morris, I just can't. Also, just provide us when they're not worrying at a problem, they're giving in to the pleasures of just marvelous painterly handling and beauty, often with figures whose activities are somewhat obscure or unclear. But this one is also in this collection. It's one of Maurice's most beautiful pictures. Maurice went, visited the West Indies, visited Trinidad, also visited Havana as a guest of Cornelius Van Horn, who was a great benefactor of this institution. And in fact, we wouldn't maybe have Maurice without Van Horn. It might be worth a digression, because he bought a painting by Maurice, the story goes, hung it over his fireplace, and invited Maurice's father, David Morris, very sensible, to come over and have a whiskey. And Morris came in and said, "What's that painting over? That's very good, rather good, that painting." He said, "It's by your son." And then he proceeded to convince him to let him go to France to paint. So this is the unofficial history of patronage and the shaping of Canadian art history. These are other pictures by Maurice that, to me, it was interesting. I worked with a young woman in Toronto to prepare the PowerPoint, and she kept switching around. I hope we do have them right now. Which ones were by Doig at the end of this talk, and which ones were by Maurice? Because there was that beautiful color sense, the sense of staining, wet into wet painting, the kind of approximate form, the sense of the moodiness that comes from not. If you flash back to Jérôme's painting of the head of the turbaned African man with all of its clarity and definitiveness, that European definitiveness. This is all about really being adrift in a kind of in what is for him a really sort of dissociative state. Again, perhaps something to do with the whiskey. But it feels very close to Doig, to me. This one too. I mean, there's a series of paintings called Paragrand that I don't believe are in the show here, but I think you can find them in the catalog, in which there are, scarcely limbed figures that are waist high in the water, and one is left to kind of conjecture about what's happening on the day that's being depicted. This one's in the National Gallery. So here we come back to this beautiful picture that we started out with, Grande Rivière, and I want to just raise a little salute to Pierre Thiberge, who was once the director of this museum, and who then went on to lead the National Gallery of Canada, and who's now retired and is living on St. Clair Street, a few blocks from me in Toronto. But he, through the no doubt advocacy of Kitty Scott, who was his curator of contemporary at the time, acquired this painting when such paintings could be afforded by Canadian museums. And thank God he did, because we're very, very lucky to have such a picture in a Canadian museum. It's an incredibly important work, and gives you all kinds of places to go in it. I want to just draw your attention to this wonderful little zapper I have here. This area over here, where there's just the faintest suggestion of a habitation, and one isn't sure what kind of an outpost this is. I've always found myself thinking about Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, when I look at this, because it is beautiful, lush, available, but also there is this sense of the darkness beyond. And when I spoke to Doig about painting the tropics, he said, the thing that is so striking when you live there, when you're not from there, is when the darkness falls and you're in in a wooded, jungle area. The darkness is so extraordinarily deep that it really is terrifying when you're not used to it, and it really provokes the most extreme sensations. So, we have a sense of the darkness beyond in this painting, and things that we can't understand, narratives. I mean, has this horse been cutted? I mean, allow me a moment to just kind of daydream. But, has the person who owned this horse disappeared? Is anyone still living there? If so, is this person a Trinidadian person? Is it a European prospector? What's going on here? There's also this host of blackbirds that are in the grass that are kind of counterbalanced against the white horse. There's a kind of symbolist feeling, and to the picture, that European presence also of Nolde and Munch and symbolism, but also of Bonnard and Vuillard, producing these extraordinary effects in the trees that are like a kind of crystallization or the degradation of the photographic negative. This is one of the things, I mean, as I said at the beginning, one could talk for hours about Doig and photography, and the sense of the corroded negative or the corroded photograph is sort of omnipresent throughout the work, and never more beautifully achieved than it is in this painting. And it's a deeply spiritual picture. Earth and sky are kind of exchanging a kiss here, and it's a whole imaginative world. And I, in the course of thinking about the piece for Canadian art, I came across, I was doing some sort of background research on Caribbean literature, and I came across a poem written by Derek Walcott, who was a Nobel Prize winner in the year, which I have right here, in the year 1992. He's a poet and playwright, born in St. Lucia, but then moved to Trinidad, and continues to reside in Trinidad and also in Boston, where he teaches literature and comparative literature and creative writing. And he wrote a poem called Konig of the River. And I want to read the whole poem, and it takes about 5 minutes, and then I'll be done. But I want to read the poem because we've talked a lot about a European/Canadian coming to the tropics and trying to make his peace with painting this Caribbean landscape and culture. And in Konig of the River, it really seems to me that in a feat of sort of, in an empathic leap and a feat of imagination, that Walcott is able to imagine the mindset of this kind of crazed loner. Konig has a kind of obscure practice in the jungle. He has survived a shipwreck and taken up some form of habitation in a remote location, and he's full of rage about the end of empire. And he's sort of an ugly, twisted remnant of Europe, kind of adrift, stranded here in the jungle. So I want to, with your forbearance, read most of this poem before I encourage you to go with Walcott in your heart and soul back in to look at Peter Doig's paintings in light of the things we've talked about today. Konig of the River. Konig knew now there was no one on the river. Entering its brown mouth, choking with lilies and curtained with midges, Konig poled the shallop, which is a little boat, past the abandoned ferry and the ferry piles coated with coal dust. Staying aboard, he saw, up in a thick meadow, a sand-colored mule, untethered, with no harness and no signs of habitation round the ruined factory wheel, locked hard in rust, and through whose spokes the vines of wild yam leaves leant from overweight. The wild bananas in the yellowish sunlight were dugged like aching cows with unmilked fruit. This was the last of the productive mines. Only the vegetation here looked right. A crab of pain scuttled, shooting up his foot and fastened on his neck at the brain's root. He felt his reason curling back like parchment in this fierce torpor. Well, he no longer taxed and tired what was left of his memory. He should thank heaven he had escaped the sea, and anyway, he had demanded to be sent here with the others. Why get this river vexed with his complaints? Konig wanted to sing, suddenly, if only to keep the river company. This was a river, and Konig, his name, meant king. They had all caught the missionary fever. They were prepared to expiate the sins of savages, to tame them as he would tame this river subtly as it flowed, accepting its bends. He had seen how other missionaries met their ends, swinging in the wind like a dead clapper when a bell is broken, if that sky was a bell, for treating savages as if they were men and frightening them with talk of heaven and hell. But I've forgotten our journey's origins, mused Konig, and our purpose. He knew it was noble, based on some phrase forgotten from the Bible, but he felt bodiless, like a man stumbling from the pages of a novel, not a forest, written 100 years ago. He stroked his uniform, clogged with the hooked burrs that had tried to pull him like the other drowning hands whom his panic abandoned. The others had died like real men by death. I, Konig, am a ghost king of the rivers. Well, even ghosts must rest. If he knew he was lost, he was not lost. It was when you pretended that you were a fool. He banked and leaned tiredly on the pole. If I'm a character called Koenig, then I shall dominate my future like a fiction in which there is a real river and a real sky, so I'm not really tired and should push on. The lights between the leaves were beautiful, and as in that far life, now he was grateful for any pool of light between the dull, usual clouds of life. A sunspot haloed his tonsure. Silver and copper coins danced on the river. His head felt warm. The light danced on his skull like a benediction. Koenig closed his eyes, and he felt blessed. It made direction sure. He leaned on the pole. He must push on some more. He said his name. His voice sounded German. Then he said river. But what was German if he alone could hear it? Ich spreche Deutsch sounded as genuine as his name in English, König, in Deutsch, and in English, king. Did the river want to be called anything? He asked the river. The river said nothing. Walcott goes on in this manner for a while with this man sort of hearing things and ranting and raving, and he starts to have hallucinations that someone is screaming, "The queen is dead, the Kaiser is dead." The voices shouted, and it flashed through him those trunks were not wood, but that the ghosts of slaughtered Indians stood there in the mangroves, their eyes like fireflies in the green dark, and that like hummingbirds they sailed rather than ran between the trees. The river carried him past his shouted words. The schooner had gone down without a trace. There was a time when we ruled everything, Koenig sang to his corrugated white reflection. The German eagle and the British lion, we ruled worlds wider than this river flows, worlds with dyed elephants, with tasseled howdahs, tigers that carried the striped shade when they rose from their palm coverts. Men shall not see these days again. Our flags sank with the sunset on the dhows of Egypt. We ruled rivers as huge as the Nile, the Ganges and the Congo. We tamed, we ruled you when our empires reached their blazing peak. This was a small creek somewhere in the world, never mind where. Victory was in sight. Koenig laughed and spat in the brown creek. The mosquitoes now were singing to the night that rose up from the river. The fog uncurled under the mangroves. Koenig clenched each fist around his barge pole scepter as a mist rises from the river and the page goes white. Thanks very much for coming.